One of the things I've seen iPhone owners do in the last few years is proudly read the fine print on the box that says, "Designed by Apple in California, assembled in India." And over the last few months, the news that has come out really makes this relationship feel super strong, thanks to the tariff threat on China. Now, 97% of iPhones made by Foxconn in India are shipped to the United States. Tim Cook said in the recent earnings call that nearly every iPhone in the United States will have India as the country of origin. And Foxconn's facility in Devanahalli, Bengaluru has already begun the production of iPhone 17 according to various reports. So this does lead one to believe that Apple is moving away from China, India is plan A, and China is in big trouble. Well, what if India isn't even plan B? It sounds very strange, I know. So I spoke to Patrick McGee recently, the author of the book Apple in China. He's been with the Financial Times for over a decade, and for this book, he's done intense, detailed research on Apple's manufacturing dynamics in China and India. So let's hear what he has to say on this.
It's not entirely clear to me that Apple wants India to be a plan B and to build like a bifurcated supply chain. I put it this way, it's tension within the company. There's absolutely parts of the company that want that to happen. And the main person behind this is the VP of iPhone production named Priya Balasubramaniam. So she's absolutely leading efforts to diversify, maybe you could say expand into India. And the way that Apple sort of portrayed this to Chinese officials is that it's not a retreat from China, it's an expansion to India. And part of that's pretty like self-explanatory and rational, which is to say that when Narendra Modi put tariffs on smartphones, fully assembled smartphones coming from China, well, you've got 1.5 billion people. The iPhone's already an expensive product anywhere, but even more so in India. And if you put a 20% tariff on the product as well, I mean, it's just becoming totally out of reach for people. So Apple has all sorts of reasons for domesticating supply chain and production in India. But what I'm pointing to is they're doing that for reasons of India building a middle class, as opposed to they're de-risking from China. They're decoupling from China. I'm not sure I've really seen or heard anything on the part of Apple, including off-record conversations and so forth, that really points to like, oh shit, this is an authoritarian country. Putting all our eggs in one basket was a bad idea. We need to get out of Dodge. Frankly, I've heard the opposite, which is that we can do the window dressing. We can get around the tariffs. But if you look at how big our retail business is in China, we're not saying farewell to that anytime soon. And so the risk, I'm basically quoting someone here, of really accelerating to India is that you're just pissing off Beijing. You're just pissing off Chinese consumers. And it's not clear that India is really going to rival China. And it's a 5, 10, 15-year effort, if it can happen at all. So I think the media narrative that you generally get is that Apple's absolutely moving to India. They're clearly de-risking, and that as it's just a matter of time that you're seeing a lot more iPhone production there. I think it's a hell of a lot more complicated than that. I wouldn't be surprised if, in a certain sense, the iPhone was even more dependent on China 10 years from now. And that's a wild thing to say, but as readers of the book who get deep into it will know, the componentry within the iPhone is more and more dependent on what's called the red supply chain. So companies like Foxconn, Pegatron, even American companies that like Corning are really being squeezed in favor of domestic, homegrown Chinese rivals. And I don't see that stopping anytime soon, because that's part of Xi Jinping's political project. And if you're as dependent on if you're as dependent on China as Apple is, it's very hard to push away from that.
But while talking to Patrick, I had one big question. Over the years, Apple has benefited a lot from China. But have we once thought about how it is the other way around? Why is China so protective about Apple's manufacturing in its country? To a point where there have been reports of engineers being called away from India, machinery being restricted from moving to India, and so on. Well, here's what he has to say.
Yeah, the idea that Apple wouldn't be Apple today without China, I think is so inarguable that it's almost boring. So I almost have nothing to say about it insofar as I try to instead flip the narrative on its head. What I'm really saying, I mean, the key line that you're pointing to, which is pretty early in the piece, is that our understanding of Apple in China is remarkably narrow. That most of the stories over the last 2 decades have dealt with the tedium of assembling Apple products, which has resulted in accusations of Uyghur labor, student labor, interns being forced to do Apple jobs, otherwise they don't graduate. Suicides at Foxconn would be, one assumes, the worst allegations. Well, those aren't allegations. I mean, there were suicides at Foxconn. And my narrative basically says none of that's untrue, and it's a good lens to view it as. But if that were the only story, the question would be, well, why would an authoritarian country put up with that? I mean, they would just boot Apple out if that was the whole story. So I argue that we're really missing the biggest piece of the puzzle, which is that China allows the exploitation of its workers so that China, or Beijing, you could say, in turn exploits Apple. So instead of it being a book that's just like tedious accounts of these dull jobs and 12-hour days, there's a little bit of that. But it's a story of technology transfer. It's a story of what is China getting out of this relationship. And what they're getting turns out to be massive. So the 2 numbers that always stick in people's minds that I think the book will forever be associated with are that Apple has trained 28 million workers since 2008, which is just a stunning number. I compare it to being larger than the labor force of California. And that by 2015, Apple was investing $55 billion into China, even more specifically, you could say, into Chinese factories. And so that's a lot of the training of the workforce, which in any given 12-month period is 3 million people. And that's an estimate from Tim Cook. So maybe it's not even an estimate, it's just the actual figure. But it's also construction of the retail stores, and in particular machinery. And I think before the book, if you asked anybody about what machinery Apple places in the Chinese factories, I think people would say, what are you talking about? Apple spends billions upon billions of dollars owning machinery and then mounting it in their suppliers' factories so that they can run at the scale and quality that Apple demands. So that's where there's just a really, really big narrative, because especially in the early and mid 2000s, the factories that Apple was working with, they didn't have the money to buy $1 million CNC machine. And Apple bought 10,000 of them and then just continued doing that for years on end. I mean, there literally was not enough CNC machines to purchase. Apple had to scour the globe and then have them reverse engineered in China just to get access to more.
Here's another thing. The iPhone has carried historically a robust industrial design, irrespective of all of its recent software and AI flaws. So how does such a technically demanding piece of technology, in terms of manufacturing, improve China's overall production ecosystem? It also does give a good idea of how India's ecosystem might also improve in the long run if Apple continues to expand.
So Apple really did just have an enormous influence, and it really is taking that like maniacal obsessiveness associated with Steve Jobs, and instead of just thinking about like the 12 people around him, maybe the 100 designers around him, and how all of them got better by working with Steve Jobs in this sort of bullying environment, but he had this vision. So all was forgiven in a sense. That's the story of Apple in China, just in hundreds of factories, sort of raising up the entire workforce. I was speaking to someone recently from Apple, and they were saying, it wasn't just engineering that we taught them, because sometimes what would happen is top graduates would come out of MIT or Caltech or Stanford, and they would go to China immediately, and they would say, like, look, I don't know how to build a touchscreen iPhone, right? But they had this like cultural dimension, right? Steve Jobs used to call this giving a shit. And he really cared about, the back of the computer, the inside of the computer, the design of the circuit board, just in terms of the aesthetics, which isn't intuitive that one should care about that kind of stuff. And so when the Apple engineers are training workforces in China, they're bringing that culture. So it's not just a engineering dimension. That could be sort of one-to-one. but the cultural dimension, I think, was absolutely critical and profound. And I think it's absolutely been absorbed by companies like Xiaomi, which now builds, not just phones, but cars. Huawei, which can now build its own operating system. So the lessons, I think, are ridiculously profound. It's hard to know what the counter narrative would be, but near the end of the book, or in one of the final chapters, I quote someone looking at the astounding rise of China in the high-end electronic sector over the last 2 decades. And this person treats Shenzhen kind of like a whodunit, like how did Shenzhen get to be the way it is? And his quote about this is, look around, there's Apple DNA everywhere.
So by now, we know that Apple has a strong relationship with global manufacturing giants like China and India. But in this relationship, who really has the upper hand? Is it the country or the Apple? If you thought Apple had the upper hand as the beneficiary, well, you might have to think again.
I don't quite think that Apple ever really had the upper hand, but I think it felt that way, which is to say, if you were an engineer doing any number of projects in the early 2000s, oh my, would suppliers bend over backwards to do whatever you needed, including it being 2 a.m. and you needed screws from some other place minutes away. People just go out and get that done. I talked to people about having issues where, you would just go down to the X-ray room, and I think the quote is, an army of people would follow you. And in a really interesting way, what the Apple engineers didn't quite think to themselves was, like, why are they doing this, right? And the answer, in a sense, is that there's like this Nietzschean will to power on the part of China to learn everything they can and to move up the value chain. And I want to say, I'm saying this in a really neutral way. I mean, you could even be inspired by the example of China. In fact, if there's a place I really want my book to have a sort of policy impact, it's India. I mean, I think India should be doing whatever it can to offer tax exemptions and stuff to get Apple into the country. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but if you're in India, I think the main message of the book is, oh my God, does it mean a lot for the world's most iconic company to base its operations, in Karnataka, in Tamil Nadu. Like, that is going to be huge for us. They bring in the jobs, they bring in the industrial clusters, they make massive investments, they train everybody, and there's a toughness associated with that. I mean, people are going to be working 12-hour days in the factories, and even in Karnataka through Foxconn, I mean, Apple has lobbied for that kind of, legal change, allowing women to work in the factories overnight and things like that. I mean, they will get stuff done if as a government you incentivize them to. So I think their impact is just absolutely profound. And, the line I use is that multinationals were not calling the shots, but it felt like they were. What was really happening was they were responding to the siren call of an emerging superpower. It's hard to say exactly when it flipped. This is probably not a great analogy, but there's no particular year in which Latin became French. But over the years, that's what happened. Right? I mean, these things just happen on a day-to-day basis, and over the course of years, there are many inflection points. The book does begin with one of these inflection points, which is that Xi Jinping comes into power, and within 36 hours, Apple is being attacked on all fronts, and it leads to this 3-week period until they apologize. And that's really the political awakening for Apple. So that's a ridiculously important episode. I don't think Apple quite notices how well the Chinese competitors have caught up until 2018. And the brilliant thing about that chapter 36, is that none of it is based on interviews. It's all based on internal court documents made public, but hitherto unreported on. So the sourcing for that chapter is just phenomenal, because it includes like a deposition of Tim Cook, emails between Tim Cook and his top deputies, emails between Tim Cook and the board of directors at Apple. So there's a lot of stuff in the book that really backs up a lot of these claims. But yeah, in terms of when did they notice that, they're being asked to do a lot of things? I suppose if I had to pick a year, I would say 2016. I would just say that because that's when Apple really has its first major problems, where the iTunes store is blocked or taken down. And or they're forced to take it down, maybe is how I should put it. It's also the same year they have to ban VPNs, right? Essentially, it means that all iPhone owners, whether they like it or not, are behind the Chinese firewall. It's when apps like the New York Times and WhatsApp are banned. And so that really is like a flex, let's say, on the part of Xi Jinping, that you're in our country and you're going to institute policies that are in China for China. And I think probably that's when Apple begins to realize that they don't have a lot of political capital to expend as their partner is turning more belligerent, outspoken and authoritarian.
That's it from Patrick McGee. Do read Apple in China. I highly recommend that book. And I really do hope that Apple only has an upward trajectory in India. I hope it brings more and more jobs in manufacturing and possibly R&D. And one day I'm sitting here and we also hear a vibrant story about Apple's success in India. Stay tuned for more such conversations. Like and subscribe to AIM TV. And always remember to think AI, think AIM.